Okay, welcome and good afternoon to the Lifelong Learners Program today, Art and the Isms. Before we start, do you know why Van Gogh became an artist? Well, if you don't, I'll tell you. It's because he didn't have an ear for music. Okay, that's enough, that's enough. Art, they say, is an expression of self. It expresses ideas, feelings, visions, things that can't be expressed in words alone. That's art. And I guess I get that. But you know, I look at some pieces of art and I say, what the heck is that feeling? And then I'll look at another piece of art and I'll say, yeah, I get the feeling, but why the heck is that art? So, and I have no idea what Grandma Moses and Michelangelo, they're both great artists, but why? They don't seem the same to me. Got nothing in common. Well, here today to help us understand art is Danyeal Dorr. Thanks for coming. Danielle's personal artwork is hidden. Oh, there she hid it behind her. Okay, that's her favorite medium is charcoal. Danyeal is an Alpena native who has studied art history and has a degree from Kendall College of Art and Design in Grand Rapids. She was a curator at the Besser Museum for 9 years and taught painting and ceramics at Alpena Community College. Yay. She has been involved for, oh, this I don't believe. She says she's been involved with art for over 40 years.
Finger painting.
Welcome, Danyeal.
Thank you, Linda. I will still say finger painting counts. So, all right. Well, thank you for coming today. We are going to dive into a little bit of art and the isms. And the primary focus of this is, well, to explain what the heck's going on with some of the things in art, especially like Linda had pointed out, Grandma Moses. A lot of folks wonder why that's categorized as art alongside Michelangelo, which we'll get into. All right. So there we go. To start, I'm just going to give us a couple basic explanations. So the arts, also called the fine arts, are just different modes of expression using the imagination to create aesthetic objects or pretty objects, different environments, experiences, primarily that can be shared with other folks. So that's just what Britannica decided to call it. I'm kind of a bigger fan of Ambrose Bierce and what he wrote in 1906 in the Devil's Dictionary, which is art, noun. This word has no definition. Little more appropriate as the scope and scale of the arts is pretty huge. So that's where we'll start today. So my background is in art history, which more or less just means I'm a freaky, obsessed art nerd. So I love reading up on it. I love looking at the visuals. I want to know the dirty details behind the artist's life or what drove a piece to be done. And one of the ways I found out I could answer most of those questions was by studying art history, which I will mention is also called historiography, the fancy term we use for the college education. But it is the historical study of the visual arts being concerned with identifying, classifying, describing, interpreting, etc. Different art products and historic developments in the field. And in this definition, it covers painting, sculpture, architecture, decorative arts, drawing, printmaking. Oddly enough, that list goes on now that we're in the 21st century. So it does include film, media, music, things like that. Literature even, but. Most of the folks I discover when they're talking about art history have not too much interest. It kind of lulls them to sleep, much like Charlie Brown here, just good old yawn. So I've decided to condense that down and make this a little more palatable for general audience. So you don't have to do the giant reading that I've done. Traditionally, within the arts, we have different categories ranging from literature, visual arts, graphic arts, plastic arts, decorative arts, all the way down through architecture. Now, today we are actually going to be focusing primarily on the visual arts, just because we'd be here till next month otherwise. So when I say visual arts, we are talking about visual objects or experience consciously created through the expression or skill of an imagination. Objects made on a two-dimensional surface for shorthand. So just want to distinguish that because most of what we're looking at today will be paintings. Not all, but most. Aside from that, I would like to cover just definitions of art because it'll make what we're talking about in a little bit here easier to like digest. So I have this lovely little image talking about the definition of art in 3 different categories. So when you look at any piece of art, you can truly use these 3 categories to get an idea of what you're looking at, which is mimesis, which is a nice, really fancy way of saying reproduction or representation of reality. It's really just the replication of a human figure, a landscape, a person, a pot. It's something drawn from reality, our physical world. But then we can get into expression. And expression's a lot more subjective. So you can get into what the artist is feeling or how the artist is interpreting feelings in society. Now, these pieces are a little harder to read because you have to, as the viewer, figure out what it is that the artist is asking you to look at. Now, this last category, formalism, little trick here because it primarily focuses on form, which can be anything from lines, color, shapes, other aesthetic elements. Those do get a little more tricky, and that's where I think much of our conversation today will come in handy for. So moving on. Aside from that, there are considered to be 4 types of painting, and this is throughout history. So from cave painting to contemporary times, we will have, excuse me, portrait paintings, so portraits of individuals, historical figures, political figures, etc. History paintings, which will pretty much cover a historical scene or a battle or a dialogue or a coronation, pretty much anything you can think of. Genre paintings can be any number of things. It can be an interior domestic scene. It can be kids playing on a playground. It can be a seascape. Genre is pretty loose and out there. And then finally, we have landscape painting. Now, the funny part is throughout history, these 4 different categories have had different ranks in terms of how they were seen as quality. For a good chunk of time, landscape painting was considered the lowest form of painting. Like if you had no skill, you were doing landscape paintings. Portraiture has consistently through the ages been either top tier, like highest rated painting, or second tier. So it's usually that in history paintings, just primarily because who paid for them. So now the isms, what are they? Cool enough, these are not about sexism or racism. It's really just an official term for an art movement, which is a tendency or a style in art with a specific goal in mind or a specific group of people with an intent in mind during a similar time frame. That just officially for y'all to read. So within today's lecture, we're going to be skipping a huge chunk of history. So sorry, I didn't want to keep you here for 4 hours. So I would have had fun. You might have been sleeping and we didn't have a meal. So we are going to start at the very beginning, which will be for our purposes, classicism or ancient art. So what does that mean in terms of what we're talking about today? Greek and Roman. So this is just a quick example of 3 different aspects of Grecian art. So we have pottery, which is also figurative because you'll see the figures on the kylix here. Below that, you have an image of the Parthenon, which is a good example of architecture that was utilized at this point in time. And then over here on the right, we also have a lovely sculptural piece, the Nike of Samothrace. Now, most of these items have been held as the ideal or the pinnacle of technical form. Now, this is the important part, technical form. It's not necessarily about the creativity utilized in any of these 3 pieces, although technically speaking, they had creative energies behind them. This, however, is looking primarily, again, at technical skill. So the rendering of the human form is in proportion. You can see without any training that it's a human when you look at it. In terms of the architecture, that is still in terms of how it was laid out, looked to as a pinnacle of style to this day, the peak of good form. And then for the sculpture, sorry. There we go, got ahead of myself. For the sculpture, definitely represents realistic, natural human proportions. Not to mention, if you see this piece in person, the veil that's on there is carved in stone. That's not fabric, that's hand rendered fabric, which is pretty nutty if you think about it. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to bring in Greek and Roman art to start with, because they don't necessarily fall into our isms, it actually has more to do with the simple fact that these earliest pieces of formal art and the pinnacle of technical skill, so to speak, is they were primarily artisanal objects. They weren't necessarily crafted by an artist to be decorative in a home. They were typically, and in the Greek and Roman case, funded by usually one of three factors or people. One being the church, the government, or the state, or a very, very particularly wealthy family. I would say in terms of Roman art, I'm not sure if any of you have heard of the family, the Medicis. They're fairly responsible for dumping a chunk of their fortune into the arts. So Roman art, I included because there is a little bit of a difference between the Roman art and the Grecian art. I know when I went into school, they were pretty much teaching me to get the idea out of my head that everything Roman was just a Greek copy. Not entirely true, but there is reference from Rome, from Grecian pieces. It was unavoidable for Rome to reference those, partly because there were points in time in Rome's history when they were excavating or digging foundations, and much like we do today, they occasionally find stuff. And I was going to say, a cool part is one of the things they found was this beast. This is life size, bigger than life size, and he's actually missing, well, okay, he and his sons are missing some arms or appendages, and the snakes are missing some bodies. But I wanted to include this because it is was probably a state-funded piece of art, and it marks a pretty good transition point for us into the next part of my presentation, which is the Renaissance. Say most folks, most school kids have heard of the Renaissance just because it's kind of driven home as the art movement, which it has its merits. Leading up to the Renaissance, part of the reason it was such a major landmark in terms of the arts movement was we're post-Crusades, so we have a lot of money, a lot of information pouring back into Europe from the Middle East. Crazy part about that is Middle East, actually, Muslim countries had collected a lot of parchments, a lot of scrolls from earlier times. So they had literature that was lost to Western society just through fires or conquest, things like that. So they were able to bring back, say, copies of Aristotle and things like that for us to relearn. But it did take a while for folks to be able to translate those things. So a little buffer. We also additionally had the invention of the printing press, which if you can't spread information, it's hard to share information. So that popped that in there. Post-Black Pig opened up social structures within Europe, allowing a little more upward mobility, and probably one of the first times in history, a little bit of a middle class. Bigger than life size. Yeah. One cool thing about this is it was found in a vineyard in Italy, and Pope Julius, I believe, was a big fan of collecting statues from antiquity. So he sent his guys right out to the field. And one of his guys that he sent out there to examine this piece was Michelangelo, as of Sistine Chapel fame. Crazy part is this guy was found with no base. So this like square pediment that's happening right in here didn't exist. That was made after the fact. So, but heck, we could spend an hour just on this piece. I promise you, it's so crazy. Super cool. But moving into the Renaissance, we have hit a transition period in history where we are more or less going from ancient history to modern history. And I say that with post-printing press, so technology and language is being spread a little bit better. Literacy rates are improving. Beyond that, in the arts, we had also transitioned from egg tempera paintings, which I'm just going to tell you is a beast to work with. You take egg yolk and grind in mineral pigments that you have ground up, and you apply in tiny little patches. to the introduction of oil paint, which gave you a much longer window. So you took your ground minerals, mixed them into linseed oil, and you had hours to work with. Hours. Big difference. They also had a better shelf life. So on the screen I have right now, for my former students, I'm not sure we have the right demographic. This would be the major four of the Renaissance that most folks know today, covering our Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So we have Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Donatello's sculpture of St. George, Michelangelo's creation of Adam, and then right down here, School of Philosophy by Raphael. Now, the fun part is technically in this lower right-hand image, all of these artists I just mentioned are in there, which is pretty cool. So one thing I mainly wanted to mention that for is this is a nice launching point because this, prior to this moment, we really don't have any isms. We have classicism, but that's a big lump into like Greek and Roman times. We have ancient art. Pretty much the Renaissance, ending at about 1600-ish, introduces mannerism, which we're not going to go into too much, just because it's just an interpretation or a stylization of painting. And it lasted for about 20 years. So the scope of this, nope. Anywho. Okay, so stuff in between the Renaissance and where we're going to roughly start. We have Mannerism, the Baroque, the Rococo, the Neoclassicism, and we'll talk about the other three. Baroque, Rococo, and Neoclassicism. We're not really touching because those are still primarily funded by the government, rich people, and the state, or the church, sorry. So one of the big things that happened to get us into the isms that we know and love today is we, for the first time in history, had public art museums in existence. Prior to this, those wonderful pieces of art we just saw were not in public collections. They were not seen by the public. They were held by wealthy individuals or by the state or the church. And in most cases, like the Vatican, you might have seen, say, Raphael's painting, but only if you're one of a very, 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 very elite few individuals. And I'm talking like 10 out of thousands. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. So Switzerland was one of the first museums to open, and that's a bit of a misnomer because it was really a Wunder cabinet, so just a little cabinet full of little objects. And one of those just happened to be a Bruegel painting, so that was art museum. Our first Western museum opened in 1793, which, yes, is the French Revolution. So despite everything that's going on, they opened. And with that, they actually brought a lot of the royal collections, private collections that belonged to people who are now missing, have lost their head, are now on display for the public. Incidentally, many of the national or public collections that were available after the 18th century were relieved during the Napoleonic Wars and became nationalized. So they didn't end up in one wealthy person's collection. They became country museums. So the Museum of Switzerland, Museum of France, etc. So that gets us into our first ism, folks. I was trying not to like put too much in the first half because, well, it gets heady. So we're going to start with the dry stuff, the literature. Romanticism, as it says on the screen, really just emerged as a response to the Enlightenment values, which were very structured and ordered, and basically were the aftermath of the French Revolution. It primarily focuses on nature and man's place in nature, mainly man's itty bitty tiny little place in nature. It shoots to give you a certain humility and tries to focus on the sublime. And the sublime in this particular context is the immense enormity and overwhelming spiritual, physical power that can exist within nature, like it embodies God and everything he's capable of or they're capable of. And yeah, again, that brings man back into an itty bitty speck of nothing. So it kind of checks you, see just the awesome power of nature actually. I do have some slides. So two really good examples of the Romanticist movement is Thomas Jericho here. This is an evening landscape with an aqueduct. Now, with this particular landscape, you will see the figures right down here in the foreground. And they're kind of one of the tiniest features in the entire landscape, but you'll see a little old gentleman talking to another gentleman while we have some bathers reveling in the background. But this is all set against an immense background. The aqueducts, the last little bits of this castle, and then just this immense rolling terrain with what looks like either an impending storm or a passing storm that has kind of been left up to us viewers, which is nice. Now, on the opposite extreme of Romanticism, we have Goya, Francisco Goya. Now, Goya is known for several pieces. I decided today to go with one of his darker, more evocative pieces. You can't really look at this particular piece. I see right now we have a little window blocking guy's left shoulder, but what we see here is actually Kronos or Saturn devouring one of his sons. This is just lifted from mythology, Greek or Roman, depending on how you want to twist the title. But in this particular case, Uranus, Lord of the heavens, Lord of the earth, everything at this particular time during, like, this is the creation story. He was told that one of his children would overthrow him and take over. So he basically, this might sound familiar if you know Zeus's story, he decided to start eating his kids, because if he ate them, they can't overthrow him. Long story short, his wife Gaia, or in the Roman version Hera, decided to, with one of her children, keep him from eating it. So she took a rock and swaddled it in baby's clothing and then was pretending to suckle it. And Kronos comes along and so the child in this picture is not actually Zeus, but one of his many, many other children that came before. And yes, for follow-up, Zeus's story or, oh gosh, Saturn. He did live. He ended up taking over. So Saturn didn't really do well with this particular attempt to preserve his fate. So both of these pieces really, again, focus on just like the small itty bitty nature of man. The Goya piece was probably never really meant to be intended to be seen. This is one of my favorite parts about art history. So I can literally tell you that piece, the Goya, probably not meant to be seen because it was actually painted on the interior walls of Francisco Goya's home, roughly maybe 1819. And when he died, this, along with 13 other pieces, were discovered, painted all along the walls of his home. Never seen by anybody. And so the Spanish state decided that they needed to be preserved. So they went in and literally cut them off the walls and adhered them to canvas. So they are now exhibited in the Prado. So, you know, Goya may not have actually intended anybody to see this, but
I can
it still
understand
fits.
why.
Oh, the other pieces, they're literally referred to as his black paintings. And most of it, they're just really dark subject matter, super depressing. This is about the point in his life when he was on a steady mental decline. So might be reflected in the work. But yeah, the tiny insignificance of man. So, say it, and just because I can't help myself, the Romanticist movement in Europe did kind of spread across the ocean to the Americas in sort of a way. So we get to touch on the Hudson River School. And this is the piece that we're looking at right now, which is Thomas Cole and the Oxbow. Again, this tries to focus on the enormity of nature, the smallness of man, and in some cases, just, I guess, the savagery of nature. Also pointing to the order of the sublime, but in this, there are people. I promise you, there are people. So where my mouse is going, way down here, there's a little guy on the river. Mouse pads terribly. There we go. Little guy, right? Okay. Touchpad. Okay, so lower right corner, that little dot on the river, that's a guy in a boat. So thank you. But yeah, guy on a boat, and in the foreground, you can actually see what looks like the remnants of a parasol or somebody like planting a flag. It's just with that impending storm, nature is definitely going to win. So all those lovely little figures don't really stand much of a chance, but drives home the enormity of it all. I just like these primarily. I had to slide them in because I'm a bit of a biased Hudson School lover. So, but it also was one of the few chances in this presentation that, like, prior to 1900, I can throw the Americas in here. So, because prior to the 1900s, we as US citizens didn't have very many, as Europe would put it, quality artists. I just work here. That's all I know. Sure.
Landscape painting was considered a low art form. Is that still true in the Hudson School started, or is that?
It was still considered true. Yeah. They did take this to a whole new scale. So like this painting's roughly like 8 feet by 9 feet. So when you stand in front of it, it's your entire field of vision. The enormity of it. And that actually may have been arguably one of the best reasons that the Hudson River School approach landscapes was just, yeah, no, you can imbue a lot of different aspects of, well, politics, nature, religious commentary, a variety of things. Not going into it too much, the Hudson River School did a lot of landscape paintings like these that were actually more subversive than we would like to see by looking at them. They were indications of the impending tensions of the Civil War and aspects like that. Like, oh, I spared you. I was going to throw Frederick Edwin Church's Cotopaxi in here. What? I know. Somebody in the audience likes it. Okay, sorry, folks. We move on. So we are, by the mid 18th century, we actually start getting art schools. Like, this is the first time in modern history that we have art schools. We don't have apprentices going in and learning after larger artists the way that many artists in the classic era did. So like Greek or Rome. At this point in time, we also began to have these schools and institutions distinguish between what is art and what is done by an artisan. So the argument of art versus craft. It's kind of a fuzzy line even today, still arguable, but this point in history is where that kind of happened. So mid 1800, and yeah, they started really piling on a lot of different categorical things that will make us all crazy. Particularly bringing this up because mid 1800s, we have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which allowed us to transition to new forms of manufacturing. Between Great Britain, continental Europe, and the US, started the Industrial Revolution just around 1760 or between 1820. So there's a little wiggle room there. With this, allowed mass production of different things to be more easily achieved. So like printing press, flyers, postcards, things of that nature. And beyond that, it gave more people access to the arts than previously able, because you now had a class of folks who were not working the farm all day. They were working the factory for X amount of hours. And it also created the weird little middle class. That middle class is really good for the arts, guys. With this particular emergence of art schools, I wanted to touch on, there also came a bigger focus on formal. So by formal, I mean more scientific, more clinical approaches to the art. People were focusing more on reality. So going back to anatomically correct images of people, proper shadows, things of that nature, rendering landscapes to look like photorealistic landscapes. And everything actually just got far more rigid. So that's a good time, which leads us into our first ism, guys. Our first ism. So Impressionism is one of the first movements we have on the list here. And it at its earliest level was really just reacting to that whole bit I was talking about, the academies and the scientific approach and the sterile nature of the arts. So we're that first public art museum open. We also started having critics and salons, and people were able to exhibit. And this actually ultimately started a dialogue amongst artists and the patrons who at this time, first time in history, really we have individuals, not the extremely wealthy, able to purchase art. So that's going to come up again. So we have the Impressionists, who were primarily in France during the late 19th, earliest 20th century. I was going to say it is usually a relatively small group of people. You've probably heard of Claude Monet or Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Pissarro, Basile Degas, Manet. I will throw in the American Mary Cassatt, if she counts. It's also one of our few girls in this early state of conversation. So, most conspicuous or the most obvious characteristic of Impressionism was they were trying to accurately and objectively record visual reality. So, wanted to get as close as they could without actually using a camera. Because guess what happened right around the 1850s, folks? We had the invention of our first camera by Mr. Daguerre. So that kind of changed the art scene. So they started, as artists, asking themselves questions like, well, if I can take a photograph of it, why would I paint it? And I really don't have a good answer to that today. Well, because you can do things with it. So I'm going to bring up Claude Monet to start with, just because he and these two images are pretty decent examples of some of the characteristics of Impressionism, which is heavy brushwork, focus on light and color, and the coolest part of all of this. So I mentioned new technology, industrial revolution, things changing. So with the birth of Impressionism, it also just happened to be coincided with this really nifty invention, which was aluminum tubes that you can put oil paint in. Prior to this, you as an artist would have to go to the field, do a live sketch, take that back to your studio and work from your studio with your paints, primarily because you were not able to take your paints with you because you stored them in pig bladders and things like that. You poke a little hole in there and let it just ooze out. So not sure how many have played with actual pig bladders, but think of storing some like paint in a water balloon and praying like all hell that when you poke it, it doesn't explode, pop, burst, smear, any number of things. So it became a little bit logistically difficult to take those items into the field. So about 1850, we had the introduction of oil paints in aluminum tubes. Bizarrely enough, this allowed artists to actually go out in the field and try to capture the light as they saw it. So we have the birth of Impressionism. On the top left here, it looks like it's a blurry picture. I promise you it is just a barely blurry picture, but that's how it is rendered. We do not have great detail on any of the figures. We are looking mostly at light and shadow. The color is to reflect that light and shadow. So in the poppies we see over here, it's really just a hint of red and a hint of pink. There's no defined actual floral shape there. It's been left open for us to interpret. Now, this little piece over here, sunrise, this is nice. I only say nice because it really emphasizes the use of color and the brush stroke, mainly the brush stroke. If you look at it, you can see like swashes, just squiggles. And I say that because you can almost see how he attacked the canvas with the paintbrush and just applied on the paint. And even our little boater guy here is not perfect. The second boat, also not perfect. And all this hot noise right here that we interpret as ships and factories in the background, that's just us projecting that on there. We really, short of taking a photo from where he was standing, are just making that assumption right now. So this is from a super dorky point. The light and values in this particular piece are so good in the sense that the shadows are shadows, the lights are lights. Should have done this actually. You can take this picture and put it in black and white. Just flip it with a filter to black and white. And the only thing you see is a little boat in front, little boat in back, and then this gray mass. That sun disappears entirely. It just blends right into the clouds. So the value is so close to the color that when you change it to black and white, it just disappears into that gray. And I mean, to us right now, it looks like that orange is entirely separate. It's bright. It's completely not going to fade into just like that perfect shade of gray when it's turned to black and white, but it does. I kind of really regret not actually having that image on here now. It's just a nice way to illustrate how closely they paid attention to color. I will mention that this particular movement, when it was first revealed in those public art galleries, salons for the first time, it wasn't really received all that well. And there's a big reason. And that main reason will be coming up again and again as we get further into the isms. And that is compared to those Greek and Roman pieces. Would you say this is technically harder or technically easier? Like, does this involve more work, more craftsmanship, where the line work of the artist, was that careful, studied, perfectly nuanced, or in this particular case, a little more loose, a little more gestural? So this is the beginning of the slide into more emphasis on the idea behind the painting than the technical skill executed in the painting. That's one of the things that makes a lot of folks crazy about modern art, myself included. All right, so part of the conversation of the focus on light by the Impressionist is really well illustrated by Monet here. So you might know Monet for his water lilies. Everybody's seen the water lilies. If you didn't know it was Monet, it's Monet. Those particular pieces are really well represented throughout many cultures, primarily because of just what they are, the scale, and what they mean as a whole, in summary of Monet's work. Now, what I have behind me right now are several different versions of haystacks that Monet painted. So Monet was a little bit out there. He would go out into the field or out into the courtyard and paint different times of the day, different times of the season, and you try to pick the same subject or the same location and just paint. So we have everything from sunrise to sunset to winter sunrise to fall sunset. He did probably, I think, 60 plus of these over the course of a couple of years. But he didn't just focus on haystacks, folks. He also went much more difficult. What we have here is just a small sample of color studies he did of Rouen Cathedral, which is in Paris. Just different times of the day, different times of the season. Same exact building, same exact location. Like some of them, like this one, kind of have an eerie black and white photo quality to them. No, just the paint colors he used and the time of day. But yeah, every one of these is a whole different painting that took him about 2 years to complete the whole series. They're spectacular. I can only say, look up Rouen Cathedral and that. I'm just absolutely in love with these pieces, so not very helpful. But these do help characterize in a short fall swoop of how the Impressionists did focus on light. Because like this top left guy doesn't have a lot of detail, but you can still tell that it's the same place as this one, which has a lot more crisp rendering, but not necessarily more detail. Yeah. Who knew one building could have so many different faces? All right. So I included another individual who had quite a bit of use of color in his pieces that most folks are really, well, fairly familiar with. Just to illustrate that color was used for more than just light studies of different subjects. It was also used to help illustrate the increasing social isolation that was being felt in Paris at this rapid stage of growth with industrialization, the spreading of the city, etc. So we have the absinthe drinker on the left here, and she is one morose little lady. There's so much dialogue just behind like these individual pieces, so I'm trying to keep it bite size for everybody. But these were models that were hired. Gal is drinking absinthe, and just the muted colors and the mixing of the browns to achieve the black kind of give this a really, for lack of a better word, kind of a depressing setting. There's not anything bright, color, crisp, saturated, just between her body language and the colors around her. It's fairly dreary. But countering with that, to the image to the right of the absinthe drinkers we have dancers at the bar. And this is highly characteristic of just the bright, saturated, almost in this case, ascetic colors that were used by Impressionist artists. But and to the right of that, we have another variation of dancers. Degas was a wee bit obsessed with dancers, guys. So we have a much more realistically rendered piece with the star than we do with dancers at the bar. Both are different explorations of color and line work. I'll say, yeah, I could, really hard not to cover the whole aspect of all of this because it's just so good. Sorry, the guy was really obsessed with dancers, like spent 40 years getting to know them, all those kind of things. Could tell you probably who every individual in those pieces were at the time of day when they were doing practices. So the only other thing he was more obsessed with was horses. So, okay. Moving from Impressionism, we are heading to Cubism. Now, I know a lot of folks find this just a garish movement. It's bright, it's colorful, it's kind of hard to tolerate. I just say that because it's typically very distorted. Has, when I say wild brush strokes, they're not organized in a nice even pattern. You don't have the blending of the brush strokes. You can literally see that the paint was just on the canvas. And it doesn't go anywhere, it's just there. It's a good way for these folks to convey different emotions or different experiences, but it really did emphasize condensing the form down so you didn't have, say, the crazy details of the cathedral. You would have just the shadow at the front and the shadow at the side. Oh yeah, good explanation would be, so if they painted trees, they'd look like trees, but they might be red trees or fuchsia trees or neon orange. So just varies. Most of the reason behind their movement was being reactionary to the Impressionist movement. So not necessarily studying light for what it was being seen and shown in front of them, but looking at light as just value. So each color has a different value. Some are brighter than others. So an orange might be in the same scale as an orange, as a yellow, but orange is probably not going to read as bright as red. Just how our eyeballs are rigged. Beyond the color aspect, these folks, the Fauvists, were some of the first individuals to start collecting African or oceanic art, or just non-Western art. It was about the time that, you know, we had a little more colonialism happening. I have skipped through a couple of things in here just because this is about the time that we'd see Art Nouveau. I say most folks have seen Art Nouveau's work, usually Austrian German in terms of its location, very French. You get the super curvilinear lines, those whiplash-esque shapes, very decorative. From my experience, most folks have seen it or seen some variation of it today, so we just kind of left it out because at its heart, it's just a very pretty art. So I don't usually get a lot of folks saying, well, why is that important? Why? But I do have a lot of folks asking about the Fauvists. So with the Fauvists, the use of unnatural color and heavy brush strokes laden with paint definitely help bring out the figures. So over here, we have a piece by Matisse, and I'm just going to say probably easily recognizable to everybody here. That's not natural color. She's not a blue lady. But in laying this out, he was able to use color to present the planes and structure of her face and indicate where shadows happen to be, like just under the brim of her hat. Amongst other things, like her arm here almost gets lost into her dress until you're looking at it for a few moments and realize, oh, that's a appendage hanging off in the corner there. But the strong use of brushstrokes allows him to break down the color field and apply them in a manner that looks like there's a background. So she's sitting in front of something. This is really just her in front of a blank canvas. So that's all been embellished for us. Now, I included this piece by Delany, partly because it really, really highlights the, heavy brushstrokes. Like you can literally see almost every individual brushstroke on this piece. It's helpful because this particular artist used the brushstrokes to create like directions. So everything in his suit jacket is kind of going diagonal, while every chunk of the background behind him is going in the opposite kind of angle. And then behind his neck, it's actually kind of going side to side horizontally. But if you get close and you start looking at his hat and his flower and everything else, no, that's literally brushstroke of color, brushstroke of color, Now, we're starting to get to the point where I have folks say things like, well, my 12-year-old could do this. Why is this good? This is subjective. This is arguably good in a historical context because it is responding to the movements before them, responding to new technologies, and in this case, paint that can travel and more accurately, bright, crazy saturated colors. Some of these colors didn't exist prior to 1900. Just a little tidbit. We could give you a list, but so we have further artists who were, again, focusing on the unnatural colors, but you can still make out the forms. So with the Matisse piece, we can still make out that these are arguably women, but we see several figures, looks like spinning in a circle, dancing, however you want to interpret it. But despite being abstracted or flattened or kind of kitty-wampus in many regards, we can still, or a child can still look at it and say, okay, people. Color's way off though. Lower right-hand corner, we're looking at a piece by Andre Derain. This kind of really highlights the, no, we're still looking at reality for our source of inspiration. So this is most likely an actual location. However, with this particular location, we are looking at red trees, blue trees, orange people. And if we look at the people, they're not necessarily rendered to the technical skill of the Greeks or Romans, as I would put it earlier. We're not in these pieces actually judging them, or we're not meant to be judging them for their technical skill and rendering perfect figures or perfectly realistic landscapes. Here, we're actually looking at how well they play with color and the abstraction of those items.
Yeah, it's around this time when your last picture really kind of seems like the colors get richer, but they also get like purples. Some of the blends that you would get. Is this a change in availability of things like pigments that allow this to happen around this time frame?
This is the
Industrial Revolution, and
Yeah.
also that above it for a lot of that.
Yep. This was more or less made possible by the Industrial Revolution with the access of paint tubes. And with those paint tubes, we also had unnatural colors being processed. So prior to this, we had a lot of colors being processed through natural dyes or actual minerals that you'd grind down. The industrial manufacturing process introduced a lot of really interesting things. So we were able to produce fuchsias, carmines, that lovely violet. And actually, in order to touch on what you're talking on, just like, good eye, is leading us closer towards the argument that the Impressionists, the Expressionists didn't use black in their paintings, which is not 100% the rule. It's pretty close to the rule, but there are exceptions. Most of these pigments in these pieces, especially like in Derain's piece, you're really not going to go in there and find a black, like an actual black from a tube of paint black. Most of those black colors are achieved by mixing opposites on the color wheel. So if you've ever painted before and taken your paints, like your kids' watercolor paints or tempera paints, and just watch them mix all those colors together, and you get like this hideous shade of like pukey brown. So when you mix different colors together, you are actually able to make a natural gray. So if we mix blue and an orange, we will create a natural, as close to those two as you can get to a natural black or dark. If you add white in there, it actually makes a perfect gray. It's kind of a fun part of color theory. But yeah, so we were starting to branch away from blacks. And that was more of a technical challenge, primarily imposed upon the artists themselves. That's why I say it was almost a rule, but not entirely a rule, because there are exceptions. They focused on removing black from their palette because, at least this is the big academic argument, that with the advent of the camera, everything was being shot in black and white just yet. So they were trying to break away from anything that made it familiar or like relatable to the camera. So if you have a picture like this where you don't have any black from a tube, you're using just natural blacks that you can find or create, you're staying as far away from that camera reference as you can, which, who knew? Yeah, the camera, it's very cool, but It's kind of a nuisance in the arts at this point in history because there's a lot of existential like, well, why are we going to make art? We can take a picture of it. Why? And most of that is for the spirit. All right, so from Impressionism, we move to Expressionism. This is where we start getting into the more heady work, which leave a lot of folks looking at it like, why is this important? It's smudgy, it's scribbly, looks like my child could do it. So with this particular movement, we move from looking at the real world around us, so like actual trees, actual houses, actual people, and start looking at internal themes. So this is where we start seeing a lot of emotion, a lot of anxiety, a lot of desire, a lot of, well, yearning. Oh, yeah. Also a lot of distortion and exaggeration to emphasize that emotion that the artists are trying to convey. Like I just kind of, there we go. Talk past all my talking points, scooched ahead. So, cool part, I love this part about this particular movement. We have strong, bold brush strokes. So again, taking a lot of paint and just piling it on the brush and smearing it right on the canvas. Gives it a little more depth, a little more feeling. You actually can kind of see the direction the artist was going, or if you're really nerdy, you can actually probably see how they painted the whole thing. Just depends on how long you want to stare at the piece. So, Expressionism, I will mention, was also kind of the emotional reaction for the artists around Western Europe at this point in time, because I don't know if you looked at the date, there's like this little conflict coming up that's going to change everything in a short period of time. So with Renaissance artwork, we saw the end of feudalism into a much more democratic-ish kind of society. With the Industrial Revolution and the onset of World War I, we see the end of royal families and a republic setting. So a little shift in the dynamic of what's happening in the world. So playing on the tensions that are happening around Western Europe, a lot of these artists are not attempting to show those horrors or that chunk of reality that's just so dim and dark and stressful. They instead decided to focus on the inner images. Bad part is they have a tendency to try to play on their viewers' empathy. So we get a little more dialogue between you, the viewer, and them, the artist. I picked two of the most iconic pieces I could think of. I'm not sure if everybody realizes these are almost contemporary pieces, and that they're both from the Expressionist period. They are really handy for showing that heavy brushwork. If you've ever, and I really highly emphasize, like if you ever get to see a Van Gogh in person, do it. Just because if you can get, heck, even if they keep you 5 feet away from the piece, you will be able to see how much paint is piled on that canvas. It's so hard to like not fully be awestruck, by the amount of paint that was smooshed on there, but just the amount of time and energy it had to take him to meticulously go through and do each one of those brush strokes. With those particular heavy brush strokes of Van Gogh's, we do get nice directional feeling. We get higher levels of paint, lower levels of paint that aid in the illusion of depth and well, not realism, but depth and illusion. Not to mention, it gives us a little play with the night sky in terms of the stars. And all I can say is if you've ever tried to paint stars on a dark sky night, it's a trick. So this interpretation is quite extreme in terms of the heavy brushwork. Now, when this piece was created, it was not particularly received well. Who knew? It actually took well past him passing and his brother passing and his brother's wife, his brother Theo's wife, advocating for Van Gogh around Europe and specifically France, trying to get his work in galleries and push for it to be sold. And she did a magnificent job. But even without her work, it is arguable that that Van Gogh would actually have gained some notoriety on his own, because at the time, and even to this day, he's still one of the few heavy-handed brushwork individuals that stylized his work just so that it's the fingerprint. I don't know if it's really hard once you see this piece to see any of his other work and not realize Van Gogh. I don't have to go to art school. That's Van Gogh. Now, we're gonna move to the left one here. This particular piece. Uh-oh. Okay. I was like, everything shut off. Okay, so now that I can actually point out the image versus like, hey, that thing. So this is a piece that I hear a lot from many different individuals, regardless of age. I could do that. I could paint that, or my kid could paint that. Well, maybe. It's kind of a difficult conversation to have there because maybe your kid could do it, most likely not. Funny part is the snarky art school answer. Gotta love the snarky art school answer. So why is that famous? I could do that. Answer one, but you didn't. Second answer, they did it first. And the reality is, third answer, less snarky. They did it first. There are precedents behind it that make it kind of important. And in this particular case, in the artist's lifetime, he maybe showed this piece a couple of times and then didn't show again because even his contemporaries, his artistic peers were like, what the hell is that? So he actually realized, no, this is pretty extreme. I'm gonna like keep it locked up for a little while. Just because it looks like crayon, but is actually tempera, which is type of acrylic paint on canvas or board, actually cardboard. And this particular piece, he created like 6 or 7 different versions of, and I'll say, it's expressive. I'm say, how many people have seen this piece prior to this? Say, does it present a happy scene? Does everybody feel warm and fuzzy on the inside? Or is it one of those, no, this is causing feelings and I'm not sure why. This particular piece has been used to quantify or symbolize anxiety, stress, grief, a number of different things, primarily because of the figure in front. Now that figure in front is not technically well rendered. And I mean, technically in the Greek or Roman standard, it's not anatomically correct. It's not technically proportional. We don't really have indication of the scale between the figures in the background to the figure in the foreground. Then arguably, whatever this lovely S-curve is a hot mess of, is that a landscape? Is it water? Is it buildings? Is it shoreline? It leaves more questions than it gives answers, but it doesn't matter much going on there. We always kind of come back to this face, this like stressed out kind of Home Alone face. It really exemplifies the distortion, the exaggeration, and in some cases, the emotion that the artist is trying to get across to the viewer, which in this case is actually despair. This piece actually has great backstory, but that's a lot of backstory. Oh, super random. We can also use art to quantify changes in the environment throughout history. So in the background, this when it was first created, those crazy reds, those rich oranges, those bright yellows, Europe was actually at this point experiencing volcanic winter because Krakatoa had erupted just a year prior. So we had volcanic ash, sulfur dioxide rich in the atmosphere, which caused for some of the best sunset paintings in Western art at this point. Screen being one of them. All right. Another side of expressionism, I'm going to try to go a little quicker. We have Modigliani on the right with a portrait of his wife, Jeanne. And then to the left, we have a piece by Wassily Kandinsky. I wanted to include something by Kandinsky because most of the time folks look at his work and say, oh my gosh, anybody could do that because it's usually a lot of scribbles, a lot of lines. It's very theoretical, very analytical, and I'll say even as an art historian, I still am left scratching my head sometimes with it. So I wanted to include this piece primarily because in terms of expression, when you look at it, it's kind of deceptive because it has arguably bright, happy colors. Some figures on horses gallivanting through the foreground. But it's one of those mixed messages in expressionism that I kind of want to cover, which is lovely painting, looks innocent from the start, but those horses, there's actually 4 of them. You can make any connotations with 4 horses, you might know where I'm going with this. So they're actually the four horses of the apocalypse with their riders. So this is actually not meant to be a bright and happy picture, but a more eerily creepy, depressed invocation of what's coming in Western Europe at about this point in time. And yeah, he just gets actually further down the crazy hole as we go. So, all right, everybody's least favorite, Cubism. This one I get a lot of flack for. Heck, even in my day-to-day non-art related job, I hear a lot of questions regarding Cubism. Like, what the heck is it? I don't understand it. It's a bunch of lines and color. It's a long list. So Cubism has technically three different forms to it. It can be proto-Cubism, it can be analytical Cubism, and it can be synthetic Cubism. That means nothing for what we're going to talk about today. It just means it goes from one level of crazy to an extra level of even more analytical and crazy. So with Cubism, we're looking at geometry specifically, and then at form, and then they'll use collage and focus on volume. Now, the big part of why Cubism is big at this point in time is we have a lot of folks looking at what art is supposed to be, and they are arguing that it shouldn't be that anymore, because we are no longer making art for the state, for the church exclusively. It's still happening, but it's not the only source of funding for it. So instead we have private wealthy individuals, and then we have the public, and we have art museums that are now willing to buy people's art. Who knew? So what we're focusing on here is an emphasis on two-dimensional flat surface, and just looking at that as the picture plane. We're going to skip out of techniques of perspective, so making it look like it's 3 dimensions or full form, any of that hoopla. We're going to get rid of foreshortening and all kinds of stuff. Best analogy for Cubism is if you take a little paper cup, just like a little Dixie cup that you buy anywhere, you cut it down the side and you lay it flat. That is now your Dixie cup, which doesn't really help when you're looking at some figures. You're like, how does that happen? But it does semi-explain. So the image on the left by George Bach, we're looking at trees and then houses. And if you look at them, you can sort of see that we have the roof line happening through here, and then 2 walls right through here. But then you're kind of left wondering what in the toast is happening here. Now, this is actually a house, and he tried painting it from 2 different angles at the same time, which, if you think about it, yes, that sounds really difficult. And yes, it is really difficult. But it's up there with taking that Dixie cup, painting the Dixie cup, or cutting the Dixie cup open and then painting the Dixie cup. That's more or less what Cubists were doing. So they're taking the aspect of the house and swooshing it out, trying to cover left and right side at the same time. Now, Cubism didn't just like come out of a black cauldron out of nowhere. It did have roots in another artist, French artist by the name of Cézanne. Now, if you look at these, they don't look like they're Cubists. They just look like fairly blocky houses, like a little smokestack off in the corner here. I mean, our trees still look like trees. I mean, they still drive from parts of reality. But with this particular piece, that abstraction of the houses, so the fact that this house back here, like there are windows, but the windows are just represented as a strip of green. And then in the foreground, there's this wonky, weird shape right through there. That's actually like a courtyard wall. You wouldn't know that until like you either A, obsessively studied Cézanne, or B, stared at this work way too long. So this particular individual is pretty much what prompted Cubism. The artist looked at Cézanne and realized, okay, so we don't have to paint traditionally or academically like the Greeks or Romans, render everything perfectly and emphasize the technical skill I have as an artist to make this 2D-dimensional piece of paper look like it's a real person. So that part's handy. Instead, we end up with an attempt to render a figure from 2 sides at the same time, which is this piece by Picasso. Now, even when I was in art school, Picasso is still kind of a hot debated topic. Love him or hate him. It's really kind of not a lot of middle ground. This particular piece was actually a group of prostitutes that were paid to be painted, and he had more or less tried blocking their form in just making square shapes of, oh, this is an arm, so it's a rectangle. Okay, this is a hand, so it's a square. This is the left side of her face versus the front, which is, depending on the lady you're looking at, kind of trippy. Because we got the eyes on the full frontal look, but the nose is from the side, and then the mouth is also from the front, but then the shoulders from like the side, but the boobs are from the front, and the waist is from the other side. You're kind of getting this. No, he literally took and twisted the figure all the way down. And I've often asked, well, what's with the baboon face or the mask over here? Not necessarily drawing on animals. These were references to African masks or oceanic masks that Picasso had been starting to collect or gain interest in. This was a point in time when we were starting to have more art from those areas evident or presented in Europe. So it was influencing what the artists at the time were doing. And oddly enough, these masks will make a large appearance in his work later on, but not as recognizable. So he goes from twisted and flat to much more crazy as he goes, just making it harder to actually recognize what he's painting. So Futurism, I'm going to touch on just because it's nifty. Italy and France at this point in time were having a little bit of a competition in terms of artists. Italy had a long standing tradition of, well, Greek, Rome, all kinds of sculpture, Pompeii, murals, everything. Italy is not a culturally dead continent, or not a culturally dead state, excuse me. It has a lot of history, as it is the driver for tourism today. Anywho, so at this point in time, about the 1900s, you had a whole lot of artists looking at it saying, I'm over this dead white guy stuff. We have too much history, too much crap bagging us down. We're just gonna throw it out the window and move in a whole new direction. So they decided to literally just focus on industry, urban settings, anything that was driven by technology. So in this case, cameras, movement, film, cars. Oh, I think there's one quote by, I think it's Marinetti, one of the artists of this period, literally stated that a racing motor car is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. So that Greek sculpture I showed at the very beginning, like missing the head that had the wings. Yeah, a racing car is much prettier than that. They were willing to throw that into a dumpster. Just scrap the sculpture, put the car up there. So that was their stance. Everything pre-done, prehistory, just get rid of it. So they wanted youth and modernity, speed, a little bit of violence, just part of the time. They did use elements of the Impressionists and the Cubists to create compositions that express the idea of what they call dynamism. Best way I can explain dynamism is by showing you these two images. Now the figure on the left, little weird when you first see it if you're not familiar with it. Best way I could subtly explain is think of a figure wearing very billowy clothing, like walking into a strong breeze. So just plowing along and all their clothes are blowing back behind them. You get that little whoosh of fabric from the pant legs, back from the jacket. This thing from different angles is just a trip. Best example though that I have is this piece by Balla, that Giacomo Balla, that shows a dog on a leash. It's just a dachshund and a woman walking. So what they meant by dynamism is they wanted to show movement as it's happening. And in their mind, movement as it's happening is, nowadays we have stop photography, like we stop motion, and we can see every individual frame, which at this point in time was just being done by an artist by the name of Muybridge. He did, if you've ever seen photographic stills of like a horse running in black and white or a figure walking, he pioneered a lot of things that were referenced by artists like the Futurists. And they looked at the dachshund walking or running along the owner as, okay, I'm going to paint that image as it's happening, which means that I need to paint the dog's leg in every position that it is in while it's doing its little run next to its owner. So that's why it looks super blurry and looks like the tail's like 9,000 places and the hot mess of his owner's feet and that leash just swinging all over the place. So without using a moving motion camera or like a flip book, he was able to arguably convey the motion. And it's semi-whimsical, so it's just fun to use for dynamism. So yeah, folks at this point in time were just making sure that they could challenge the past. So I probably should mention with this figure, again, movement, velocity is the big aspect of it. Wasn't necessarily trying to avoid a human figure, but they were definitely making sure that it was not technically perfect or looked like Michelangelo or David or any large sculptures that we might see rendered in a classical museum. Folks, getting closer. All right, so we have Dadaism, which means yes, yes in German. It is kind of a hoot. It starts taking little bits of technical skill, mixing it in with collage, paint, irreverent objects. The big selling point of Dadaism is it really begins to question everything. This is the downfall that makes us all crazy, at least everybody who's not studied art history. They, by questioning everything, have started to break away from what traditionally is considered good art, things that are technically rendered, things that make sense to the viewer, things that the state would have paid for or the church would have paid for, really pushed like the definition of art. Oops. So when I say pushing the definition of art, the term ready-made became popularized by the artist Marcel Duchamp, and he would truly find an object and then present it as art. Because in his mind, he was of the thought that if an artist, and this is him and his most famous piece, The Fountain. I'll let you chew on The Fountain for a moment because it's a little tongue-in-cheek. So by putting this particular piece in a public exhibition in New York City in about 1917, he more or less put forth a whole new definition of what constitutes a work of art. Because, well, he full on did not make this. He did not replicate this. He found it at a porcelain factory's garbage, dug it out, and two more things. He wrote the name R. Mutt, 1917 on it in paint. And then the last thing he did was take it to the gallery and pop it on the shelf and said, it's art. So, arguably speaking, as an artist, he technically speaking, had nothing to do with the creation of this actual object, this urinal that is now a fountain. All he did was flip it on its side. Now, this does not necessarily make it great art. I mean, visually, it's a urinal on its side, man. It's not exactly high Renaissance in terms of what I'm looking at. But it is really bringing to point the power of the artist at this time. The artist is no longer responding to a patron or the church or the state telling them what they have to do, quite literally getting to the point of, no, I made this. However that means I made this. This is art because I, as an artist, said it is art. That opens up a whole can of worms from here on out. So, this is probably one of the bigger reasons that we're having an ism conversation because it more or less spiraled from here. Cool part about Marcel Duchamp was he had a great sense of humor. He was all over the place in terms of what he would do. One of his ready-made objects that he pulled or created was he found a postcard over here of the Mona Lisa or La Gioconda, which was just a cheap mass-produced postcard in France at the time. He took it and this piece. So he refers to this as one of his first ready-mades, so an object that already exists that he has just embellished as an artist to make into a different object. He, this particular utilitarian object, he changed it by just reorientating some of the language, like this part right down at the screen, and then a little bit of text over here, and then most infamously, the mustache. So I've had art students in the past say, he seriously just drew a double mustache and a goatee on the Mona Lisa. Why the hell is that famous? Well, it's because he's super tongue-in-cheek about it. He's taken something that arguably is representative of what we typically throughout history would have said was good art, technically skilled, well executed, shows formal aspects of three-dimensional rendering, background. I could go on. And he turned it into something entirely different. And in this case, very, very tongue-in-cheek. So one thing I didn't mention about Marcel Duchamp is fairly international, French by birth, loved the Americas, spoke English quite fluently. So he would do some tongue-in-cheek things. So down here beneath the Mona Lisa, we have the word look. At least that's what it looks like phonetically to us, right? Look. So we're now looking at the Mona Lisa. But fun part is in French, it's a whole different thing. It's technically a grammagram, which is just a way of saying that those letters can be pronounced individually to make another word. And in this particular case, it's something along the lines of elle chaud et cool, which means she's got a hot ass. So yeah. So in English, it's just harmlessly look at the Mona Lisa. In French, it's she's got a hot backside. So yep. Now, the reason I have two of these versions up here is initially about 1916, he did this really generic postcard that he found on the side of a store somewhere, but it did get reiterated and reiterated. So there's like 6 or 7 different versions of this. The one on the left was the earliest piece that he has documented as far as I could find. So a little sense of humor, a little tongue in cheek. Doesn't make it technically good, but it's more of the cerebral bits behind it. All right, moving into surrealism. Well, very dreamlike response to tense society, you know, World War I, things were a little bit dark. A lot of these artists were disillusioned about the things going on in the world. So they were no longer really drawing strictly from reality, but they were delving more again into the emotional interstates. So we have dreamlike states. And it was definitely more of an objection to the status quo, what has been expected in art, what has been in art, things along those lines. And oh yeah, sorry, my little box on my screen is blocking. And it was a delving into personal symbolism, which I promise you from an audience or a viewer standpoint makes it just more confusing. Because my symbolism may be completely different from yours. Okay, there we go. It's like it's not moving. So one of the more recognizable significant figures of surrealism, and I'm not going to cover it for terribly long just because it is fairly recognizable. It's just, I think by short definition, weird. A lot of folks aren't necessarily getting the feels from it. They're just left scratching their head. That's where it comes into personal symbolism. I could go into really long lecture just on this guy and this piece. I say that because with this, we are looking at a dream state of Dali's. We have fragmented landscape, but so this landscape in the back right corner is actually a reference to physical, actual real location on Spain, not too far from where Dali lived as a child. This distorted hot mess is arguably a side profile of Dali. Question is this the nose or is this the nose? And then if this is the nose, what the heck is coming out of the nose? A lot of different things. But we have melting clocks, which were somehow, I guess, inspired by a block of melting camembert cheese on an afternoon. We have ants that are attacking time, which is a representation of the degradation of time. And I'm just going to say, I could keep going. There are a lot of quote unquote personal symbols in here. So Dali is not necessarily just approachable. Oh, I like it. You're meant to walk up to it and scratch your head for the most part until you decide to dive in and I guess get into the deep end of that. I will show you a later variation of this because this is the persistence of memory from 1931. So by 1952, he did revisit this idea and you can see it's evolved a little bit. So we've lost the pocket watch and the other clock from over here. They've like launched the pocket watch in the background. Our melty face has become much more melted and is floating through the bottom tiles here. Our other clock has now somehow drifted below the panels of the soil. Oh, we still have his little hometown reference in the back there, but now it is levitating a good chunk above the landscape. But it really does leave more questions than answers, because you're left wondering, are these bullets or projectiles or just distorted chunks of block? Are these blocks? And I do know the answers, but we don't got time for that. So Dali, if you want to get some really like mind trippy experiences with art, he is worth a dive into. I will say probably after 1950, he gets really, really out there. Let's say. But in terms of one of the few artists in the modern era that actually presents technical skill along with conceptual skill, Dali is probably the master. And I say that because pieces like this that are on the screen right now are monstrous. We're talking 6 feet by 8 feet or bigger. So just abstract expressionism, most people's least favorite conversation ever. I say that because with this particular school of art, you're not supposed to know what the heck you're looking at. That's the entire goal. Like if you can tell what you're looking at, they did it wrong. So it really focuses more on the paint, more on the canvas, more on object in the process of making the painting than it does actual technical skill. So with this, we include items like action painting, which truly, I promise you folks, is literally throwing paint at a painting. Action painting. So they weren't using paintbrushes as much. And then we were also focusing again more on color, but in color in a different way than the Impressionists were prior. So let's move on here. The hot mess of Jackson Pollock. Yes, that's how most folks view it, because this, I'm just going to say, non-representational. If you can see an object in there, it's because of your own imagination. This particular piece is truly just a bunch of paint poured over an entire canvas over the course of several days. And because I'm shiesty, I just wanted to point out, like, he is using a brush, but the brush never touches the canvas. So technically he could be using a ruler. It doesn't matter. He's just putting paint on the canvas. So for this particular movement, it's not about the artist per se. It's more about what the medium, in this case, paint, can do, or what it will say, or how it can work with each other. And from a lot of subjective standpoints, it just makes a hot scribbly mess. So this, yeah, my nephew could do this, but my nephew might not have intended to do this. And then the bad part is Jackson Pollock beat him to the punch by like 80 years. So what do you do? Oh, I will mention this part. If you ever do get to see a Jackson Pollock in person, part of the appeal, not so much like the quality of the work or matching my living room couch, is simply they're freaking big. I can't put it any other way than they're huge. Last one I saw was about 8 feet by 10 feet. So it more than took up my entire field of vision. And beyond that, there was a cigarette butt in it. So while Pollock was painting, he would step on the canvas, he would walk around the canvas. Got a quote on there where he's telling us he's more at ease on the floor than he is at an easel. But you'll find shoe prints, you'll find cigarette butts, you'll find cigar butts, you might find a booze bottle lid because he hit the juice a little hard. You'll find a lot of stuff in there. So that's sometimes more of the scavenger hunt fun of his pieces than, oh, it's pretty. Not to say some of his color combinations aren't great, but I didn't go much into abstract expressionism because Jackson Pollock is pretty much the poster child. Everything else from that time period is pretty close to. That's a big swoosh. You're not supposed to know what it is. Don't feel bad. That's actually the goal. If you know what it is, they failed. So pop art. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, we're just gonna start pop art next. So pop art, probably the most approachable of everything we touched on. Their entire goal was to make art from stuff that was recognizable, not scribbly mess that we just did. So I think everybody might recognize what we're looking at right now. Okay, Campbell soup. Resolution. Anyway. Andy Warhol, probably the poster child for pop art, he primarily decided to take objects that were easily recognizable and render them. So this doesn't look particularly impressive, but this is a mix between several different mediums. He hand painted, then screen printed, then lithographed, and did a couple other things here that are more than just somebody drew a Campbell soup can. Now, is it something you want to hang in your living room? That's personal taste. Is it technically well rendered? Yeah, technically. Does it mean anything? It's up to grabs, but I could probably show this to anybody between the ages of 4 and 80, and they would probably know what it was. So he achieved his goal in terms of it's approachable. Oh, another aspect of pop art, again, the approachable, taking objects that most folks know on a day-to-day basis and elevating it to a point of art. And this touches back to the Marcel Duchamp statement of, because I'm the artist, I can dictate that this is art. So we have Roy Lichtenstein here, who literally took Marvel comic funnies and blew them up into monster-sized pieces. This is about 10 feet by 6 feet. So it's huge. The only thing that we're lacking here, because I couldn't find good enough pictures to show this, is kind of like newspaper comics. These all are hand-painted dots, which are called Ben Ray dots. So they're just layers of little dots all over each other. And yeah, he literally went in with paintbrush and boop, 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 the whole paint. But pretty much all of his pieces were just lifted from comics. So this probably being the most notable one. And yeah, this is all it is. There's no explanation, just it came from Marvel comic, like number 71, entitled yada. So I just want to share that. Okay, so we're getting very, very, very close to the very, very, very end here. I wanted to include conceptual art because this just boggles most people. Like, what the hell am I looking at? Okay, folks, just want to point out that entire line, what the heck am I looking at, is the entire point of conceptual art. It's pretty cool because it's more about the idea behind the work than it is about the work. Very subjective, so I could love it, the rest of you could hate it. And it gets into a visual verbal conversation, often using ready-made objects. So we're touching back to Marcel Duchamp with the Dadaist and taking just like postcards and turning them into a high market piece of art. And in this case, Joseph Kosuth here. So you probably see a chair, and what looks like a definition. Funny enough, that definition is of a chair. Now, conceptual art kind of, okay, typically makes us, the audience, look at it and say, huh? And in this particular piece, it's bringing up the question of, okay, so what is an object? When I say chair, is, okay, I'm gonna walk up here just like that. Say, so when I say chair, is it this individual chair? Is the chair itself the chair, or is the word chair the chair? Or is this just an object that we have assigned meaning to, and the meaning that we have assigned it is chair, which is something you sit in. So he got very, very literal and put an actual chair, yes, one that he found, in a gallery. So you have the chair, then he took a picture of that chair to argue, is that a chair, or is that just a picture of the chair? Like a rendering of the chair, so it's not actually the chair. And to take it a step further, he put the Oxford Dictionary's definition of a chair on the wall next to it to make us, as the viewer, ask ourselves, which one's the actual chair? Conceptual art, it's a head scratcher. But if you walk into a gallery, you look at this, it definitely leaves you lacking technical skill, artistic merit, anything that resembles a picture or a pretty thing, definitely leaves out a lot of aspects of beauty, band's place in the world, things like that. It really just gets into language. Like, what is language? So we barely touched on arguably the 7 most important modern artists. Modern art stretching from 1860 to about 1960. And guys, that's really fudgy, just so you know. Contemporary art, as modern and contemporary art has loose beginning end dates right now because we are in the middle of contemporary art, because contemporary is anything that's happening right now. Modern art is subject to that because anytime that we scooch or arrange the beginning of contemporary art, we scooch and move the end of modern art. So it gets fudgy. So when I was in art school, 1960 was the hard stop for the end of modern art. Now it's a little more fudgy because it's it's about 1980. So it's ever evolving just to make us crazy. And if you're ever wondering about the isms, you're not alone. Honestly, I paid lots of money to go to a nice art school where they taught me explicitly just art history. And I still have moments where I need to refer to maps or other images to say, oh God, when did the deconstructionist architecture movement happen and who moved that or who started it? And I'm obsessed with this subject, so I'm just saying, as folks who are just art appreciators, don't feel bad. This is just the isms of recent history. So 1940 to about 2010. I have one more image just to muddy the waters even more. So we did a super cursory quick overview, which I know is a little longer than I intended because I babble. Modern art or history of art. So this isn't everything. This is just the big like top 10 names of each movement from arguably the beginning of recorded history to now. So I left out a few things today, just so you know. I did want to mention while I have anybody here, I do have a couple textbooks I would recommend if you are interested in more. I have Gardner's visual arts history book. They're expensive, you can find them used, but like super comprehensive. If you have a question about Western art in general, they'll answer it. But then I also have Modern Art, which is painting, sculpture, architecture, and photography, which is a Pearson's Prentice Hill publication. This is mainly where I got most of my information today because it's just a damn good book. Sorry, folks. It's also pricey just because they have license to pay for the printing rights of the images in there. So you get them in color versus black and white, which is kind of important. All right, so I did want to wrap up with like, I know you're like, wasn't she done? Okay, so Grandma Moses, where she fits into this giant scheme of things, she's about 1938 when she started painting at the age of 78. About this point in time in our presentation, that's when we started focusing less on technical academic skill of rendering things perfectly like the Greeks or the Romans, started focusing more on expression and feeling and story. And Grandma Moses nails the expression, the painting, and the story. They're not great in terms of technical factors, but they create a lot of soft feelings for the folks who look at them, I guess. I have little to no opinion on her. Mondrian looks crazy simple. It's about 1920s again when we started moving away from like images, beautiful figures, landscapes, technically rendered. This is more about color, structure, and this is all hand painted. And I will just say, if you think you can do it or your 3-year-old can do it, go home, try to paint a straight line in black freehand. Yeah, I'm mad skilled and it still takes a chunk of time. And then this guy, he's popular. Mark Rothko. It is more than just paint on a canvas. It's more than just color on a canvas. If you get to an art museum, I highly recommend standing in front of one of his pieces because usually they're big. So we're talking about like 6 feet by 8 feet. And you're just staring at it and all you can see are the colors. But depending on where you're at in front of them, you'll get different colors or things happening. So this piece on the left, that weird, it looks like kind of a pukey yellow, is very rich on one end and kind of faded on the other, and it kind of pushes and pulls while you look at it. And just weird things happen because your eyeballs are, well, conditioned to do different things to different colors. And more or less, it's an optical illusion that's playing with you while the artist experiments with color. Yeah. And yeah, technically 3-year-old could do it, but they didn't, and these guys beat them. So. All right, that's literally all, folks. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.